Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Rhode Island detectives knew they had a serial killer in their midst, but the victims were women who lived and worked in the sexual underground and whose bodies were never found. Then, prostitutes began to talk about a man who played very rough. Police arrested Jeffrey Mailhot, a seemingly law-abiding, ordinary citizen, and an incredible duel of wits began. A brilliant police interrogation led to a chilling confession. This book is an insider's account of a modern-day Jack the Ripper, including the killer's own words, telling police how he killed women with his bare hands, cut them into pieces, and then went off to kill again. Ripper by Linda Rosencrance. Thank you very much for agreeing to this program and this interview, Linda Rosencrance.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you very much. Now, what made you decide to write about this particular case? What was it about this case that interested you, that compelled you to write your book, Ripper?
Well, I had written 2 books previously about spouse-on-spouse murder, and my publisher told me that true crime readers liked to read about serial killers. So I began doing some research, and I found that there was a serial killer right in the next state to me. I live in Massachusetts, and he was in Rhode Island. And I did a little research and found out that, in fact, initially, he was just the man next door. And I thought that it would be pretty interesting to find out what made him do what he did.
What do you mean, the man next door?
Well, he was so average. He hadn't even had a parking ticket. And then he turned 30 and he started murdering women.
Wow.
And even after he confessed to the crime, his coworkers and friends and neighbors called the police and said, I don't care what he said, he just couldn't have done it. So
Right.
He was just like every man.
Well, when you get people testifying that there's no way he could do it, that's a little even unusual, even for people that are, again, they're incredulous that their friend could do something. So this person must have been very convincing in hiding his real, true identity.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, people hung out with him. They went to clubs. He loved to do karaoke, and they just didn't have a clue what he was doing behind closed doors.
Okay, before we go on a little bit, we're gonna get into his character right away because you're referring to that. But just for everyone out there, for those that may not know, what does the term Ripper refer to in true crime circles?
Well, it refers to Jack the Ripper, who murdered prostitutes and then cut up their insides and slit their throats, cut up their insides, and this is what this guy did. He dismembered his victims. Mm-hmm.
So it's also to do with the organs, as you've alluded to, something to
Yes.
do with it. Okay. Now let's talk about the killer himself. What, as per your research, let's go back as far as we can and talk about Jeffrey Mailhot. What was his family like?
He had a very normal childhood, a normal upbringing. His mother died of cancer when he was 17. He was in high school, and then 4 or 5 years later, his father died. But he had a supportive family. He had aunts and cousins, and there was no childhood trauma or anything that happened to him in his childhood that could account for what he did.
And you say it was a very close family. There
Absolutely.
was he did not see a counselor or a psychologist or anything like that.
Absolutely not.
And you spoke to how many people in the family? How conclusive was?
I didn't talk to the family. I tried to track them down, but I wasn't able to. But the police had information about his family. He gave them information about his family in his interrogation.
Right. So there's no history of any kind of problems in school, no behavioral problems?
None whatsoever.
Okay, so So what happens after high school? Does he graduate? Is he a fairly good student? Tell us a little bit, at least, about his adolescence life, as much as you know.
Well, I don't know much about his adolescence, unfortunately, except that he was devastated when his mother died. He didn't expect that at all, and he could handle it a little bit more when his dad died. I think he was 22. He graduated from high school. He was working in a machine shop, various machine shops in the Woonsocket area. And, he just was an average blue-collar worker. No criminal history whatsoever. He liked to hang out. As I said, he liked to do karaoke, coincidentally in a bar that the Woonsocket police like to frequent to also do karaoke. So he had crossed paths with the investigators on the case previously. But he was just your average guy. Nothing in his background accounted for what happened.
Was he aware that this place where he went and sang karaoke was frequented by cops? Was he typical of guys?
I think he did. I think it was pretty well known. But it just happened that was the place in Woonsocket where he liked to go. I think it could have been coincidental that police went as well.
So he was a social animal. He was a gregarious guy. He was, from all the evidence you have, he was a real outgoing guy with a lot of friends and as normal can be.
Absolutely.
Right. Now the story of Ripper takes place in a city that you called Woonsocket. Woonsocket, Rhode Island. Now, what is the, population pretty well, and what is the nearest big?
Well, it's about 44,000. It's on the Massachusetts border, about 15 miles north of Providence, which is the capital of Rhode Island. Woonsocket, used to be a mill town. It's very, very blue collar.
Right. Now, Jeffrey Mailhot does get in trouble, obviously. He's the subject of this book, and he's now an adult. You say his father died when he was 22. His mother died when he was 17. He was quite traumatized by that, if there is anything. What behavior characterized his adult life, and what was his overall behavior?
There was nothing out of the ordinary. He was someone that you'd want to have as a friend. He went to barbecues with his friends. They had beer. They would just go out. They would hang out together. There was one thing, however, that maybe set him apart from other bachelors, let's say, and it's something that the police were intrigued by. He was incredibly, incredibly neat. Even his junk drawer was organized. Nothing was out of place. And his closets, everything, his DVDs and CDs were stacked alphabetically. So he had a little, I would say, obsessive-compulsive disorder, but nothing that he ever sought counseling for.
Right. Now, you say that his behavior was normal as it can be as everyone else, but obviously there is some use and partaking of escorts, prostitutes. When did this behavior begin?
I would say in his 20s he started, although he wouldn't admit to it initially. And then he said, he would frequent prostitutes, African American, white, it didn't matter. But he had a girlfriend, and so. Who knows why men do those things? He didn't seek them out initially, I don't think, to harm them. He just sought them out for sex, and I don't know why. He lived in an area of Woonsocket where prostitutes frequented as well. There were various bars. It was a seedier section of the city.
Right. And he came across as, you say it's a blue-collar town, and you say this is a seedier part of the city, but he would come across as, well, just for a term, would he be more yuppie compared to the blue-collar worker?
No,
would he be really out of place in that area?
No, he totally fit in. He was a blue-collar worker. jeans and a T-shirt, liked to barbecue, liked to throw back a few beers with the guys, totally fit in.
Was he a clean-cut guy, or was he...
Absolutely
Okay.
clean-cut.
Okay. Now, you say that he had a girlfriend, so is that typical of him, that he, through his adult life, that he always had a girlfriend?
Well, he didn't have a girlfriend when this happened. He had a girlfriend for a number of years in his 20s, but he wasn't seeing her as a girlfriend at the time when that happened.
So let me get this straight, and for our audience as well. So he's a regular guy. He looks the part. He acts the part, but he does frequent prostitutes, and that's what, say, a close friend might know. Would a close friend know that he frequented the prostitutes, or was he more secretive than that? How regular?
I don't know the answer to that question. That question was never asked. So I don't know. I don't think it's something that he talked to them about at all.
Okay, so it was part of his secret life.
Right.
Now, when did women began disappearing? You say in early 2003.
Right.
Oh, now, who was the first woman to go missing?
Audrey
Who was she?
Harris. She was a mother. She had 3 children. She was a daughter. She was a sister. None of these women were really into selling themselves just for the sex. They were in it to feed their drug habits. They were all drug addicts, and that's the only way they knew to get money. They couldn't hold down jobs, so they had to turn tricks to get money for drugs.
Right. Now, how was Audrey Harris killed, and what was the circumstances of her disappearance? Well,
she had been at a party with her brother, and he left and came back, and she was sitting on a chair in the kitchen, and she was passed out on the chair, and the stove was open for heat, and he was concerned that gas was going to escape, and so he brought her into the living room and put her on a couch, and he went out, and when he came back, she was gone. And nobody knows when she left. Nobody knows what happened. She was walking up Arnold Street, which is a street in the seedier section of Woonsocket, and Mailhot pulled up to her and asked, asked how much for sex, and they agreed on $30. And the fact that he was clean cut, I think, led her to go with him more easily. They're used to going with men who maybe aren't as clean cut as this guy. He wasn't unattractive. He was fairly attractive. So she went with him, and they had agreed on sex, and she started to take her clothes off, and he said, she said to him, go, get the money. And so he was going to get the money, and he came back, and she was in the living room, and he facing away from him, and he put his arm around her neck and choked her.
Right.
The urge just came over him to choke her, and he just choked her and until she fell and died.
And then what happened?
Well, then he put her in his bathtub. He was drunk at this point. So he put her in the bathtub and went to bed, totally not remembering anything that happened. He got up in the morning, going through his routine, went into the bathroom, not remembering any of this, and saw her body. And then it all came back to him that he had killed her. So he waited till at night, and he wrapped her up in a rug, and he put the carpet in the back of his truck and drove around Woonsocket trying to figure out where he could dump her. And then he got really frightened, and he said, someone is going to see me do this. I can't just dump her body. So he brought her back home in the rug still, dropped her on the kitchen floor, and went into the living room and sat down and had a beer. And as he was sitting there, he remembered an episode of The Sopranos, where Tony Soprano killed a guy named Ralphie and then put him in the bathtub and dismembered him. And that's what he did. So he put her in the bathtub, draped her head over the bathtub, cut off cut off her head. He used a saw, just a regular hand saw, not an electric saw, and just cut her up in little pieces and put her in trash bags, and then drove around Woonsocket and disposed of her body like trash in various dumpsters.
Now, you have repeated what you have put in the book as well, and so I wanted to question you about that. You said that he had passed out, and when he awoke, and then he went to the bathroom, and then he found the body. I mean, I was just involved in a case with the same story. It's even less plausible than your character, your subject,
right.
Jeffrey Mailhot. Now, you put it that way. What do you really believe? I mean, it's the most convenient excuse. I just don't remember. It's very convenient.
I believe it. I totally believe that.
Why is that?
He was so drunk. He was just drunk. And it could be, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but it could be that his mind just shut it off. And he just went to bed as if nothing happened and totally forgot until he saw the body again. I mean, that's what he said. And I believe that. Just because based on, okay, here's the thing, and you don't go into it too much. He's frequenting prostitutes. Now, from the research that you've done for this book, is that part of his, not fantasies, but that's one of his characteristics that he likes, one of his fetishes in sex play is the choking. I mean, it's pretty characteristic for serial killers to do that and to do it with prostitutes beforehand that have testified at some of these trials. Was there any indication in your information that was a characteristic? Apparently, because when they were searching his apartment, Ed Lee found a photograph of him choking, with the same chokehold, choking a stuffed animal. So apparently he had a tendency to want to do that. Mm-hmm. But that's the only thing that they saw that led them, to think that he enjoyed doing this.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I didn't really see any evidence to lend me to believe that just happened to be an accident, because there seemed to be in your book indications that this was something that he did like. So he certainly could have passed out and did it by accident, but he certainly
no, he didn't. I don't think he did that by accident. What I meant was he didn't remember afterwards. No, I think the killing was deliberate.
Right.
But he just didn't remember it afterwards.
Well, it works in your benefit when you go to court and say that I didn't have the intent to kill, you see, by saying that I don't remember it. So I obviously couldn't have the intent. But anyway.
He confessed. So, I mean,
Yeah, that's okay. Anyway, what I wanted to say was, okay, so now they have this first person, they have this first victim. What do the police do next? And you mentioned the person that is accredited with being your co-author here, or with Captain Edward Lee Jr. Right. So he's an integral part of the story, very important part of the story and this investigation and the interrogation. So tell us a little bit about what happened after Audrey Harris.
Audrey's mom went to police because her daughter, the last she heard from Audrey was, I'm getting off drugs, which is what they always say and said, I'm going to go into rehab, I'm going to come and see you first. Right. And she didn't. And she didn't keep in contact with her children, which she always did. So her mother knew that there's something was wrong, and she went to the police and filed a missing persons report. And so they assigned police to it, and they talked to everyone she knew. They talked to her brother, but they had no idea what happened to her after she left that party.
Right.
And and then in October, I guess they assigned another investigator to her case, but they still couldn't figure out what happened to her. Then in April 2004, another woman went missing, Christine Dumont. And as with Audrey, Christine always checked in on her children. She had 2 children. She always called her sons to make sure everything was okay. They were staying with someone else because she was into drugs. She couldn't take care of them. And Right. She hadn't checked in with them. And her sister knew that something was wrong. So on a Friday, her sister went to the Woonsocket Police Department to file a missing persons report. And the officer at the desk was very flip with her and said, "You can't file a report because I just saw her last night," which he didn't. But he just didn't want to be bothered. He said, "Come back Monday." It wouldn't have made any difference because Christine was already dead. But nobody knew that at that point, and this officer just didn't want anything to do with it. So Christine went back Monday and went to fill out the report. And again, it was the same guy on duty. And again, he just wasn't being helpful. And he said, "Give me her description." And he said, "Oh, never mind. We have it in our system." So he was alluding to the fact that she had been arrested for drugs and prostitution. And, you know, so she was missing. What difference did it make? So Christine's sister, Madeline, said she was going to go to the media, but the media didn't even want to hear it. You know, because over the years other women had gone missing, and nobody at this point was saying serial killer. That wasn't on anybody's lips or in anyone's mind at this point. There was another woman missing. So nothing much came of that. But then in July, the last woman went missing, Stacy. And now the police are thinking maybe we have a serial killer on our hands, and that's how Ed Lee got involved. He typically wouldn't have gotten involved. He was a sergeant at the time, but he typically wouldn't have investigated missing persons cases. But his boss asked him to look into this because this was the third woman. And so they talked to people who knew Stacy, and the last thing that anyone knew, her boyfriend at the time, they were in a park. It was 4th of July, and she needed money for drugs. And she said she was going to walk up the street, Arnold Street, the same street where Audrey was taken from. She was going to walk up the street and find a John and turn a trick and make some money. And they never saw her again. Right. So at first they thought it was him. You know, they investigated him. And then as they're investigating her death, police got a tip from someone who said they had spoken to another woman who told a story about being taken to somebody's house and being strangled by someone. But this woman put up a fight. And this was the thing with Mailhot. It was about control. And the women who put up fights, he let them go because it sort of killed his high. You know, if you're not giving in, if you're not surrendering to him, then he didn't want anything to do with you. So he let this woman go, but she never told anyone. And he counted on that. He counted on these women not going to police because they were prostitutes, and they probably had warrants for their arrest. And besides, they figured, and he figured, no one was going to believe them anyway.
Right. Now, you say that it's kind of unusual, actually, if you look at serial killers, that reaction, that somebody actually resists him and gets away. It's almost the other way. If they're compliant, that's about the only way that they've gotten away from some of these serial killers.
Well, so actually, when the book I have coming out, the exact same thing happened, though.
Wow.
The women who fought got away.
Interesting.
As I said, these men are interested in power and control, and once someone breaks that spell, then they sort of just don't want anything to do with it anymore. So
Sure.
Police went to track down this woman whose name was Jocelyn Martell, and she told them her story. And so after she told them the house where it was at, you know, she led them to his house because she remembered. And then they went back into their files, and they found another case of another woman who had the exact same thing happen to her. The same house, and her name was Teese Morris, and Teese really fought, and she, however, went to police. He let her go, but she had left her stuff in his house, her purse, her sweater, a wig, and she wanted that stuff back. So she flagged down a cop, and she said, I want to get my stuff. And so the cop went back to the house, but they couldn't go in. They couldn't do anything. But they filed a report. So Ed Lee, when they were looking through the reports, and they came across this woman's story, and then they talked to her, and they realized that this was exactly what happened to Jocelyn Martel in exactly the same place.
Sure.
So they got a search warrant to look for the stuff that she had left.
So that was the premise for the search warrant.
Exactly. Yep. Good. To look for her belongings. And so they waited outside his house for him to come home after work, and when he came home, they arrested him on charges of assaulting those two women.
Okay. Now, what evidence did they find at the house, if anything?
They found well, first of all, they were only looking, the search warrant was only for those things.
That's right.
For Tisa's belongings. And so as they were questioning him, the police are looking, but they really couldn't look for anything else. And so they spent a long time questioning him, and first he denied ever visiting prostitutes, ever soliciting prostitutes, and then he would say, well, okay, maybe I did this one time, and then, okay, maybe, twice, and no, I really didn't. And so in their interrogation, they were trying to get him to be comfortable. So they would say things to him like, we know things like this happen. We're men, and maybe things got out of control, and you need to tell us now if something like that happened. If you murdered these other women. And he said, "Oh, I didn't hurt anyone. I didn't do anything." And finally, through really incredible police work, they said, if you did it, Jeff, just tell us. And Ed said his heart was like beating out of his chest, because there came a point where he knew that he had done the murders and he was going to confess. And finally, he just looked at them and he said, "Yes." And so they said, "All three?" And he said, "Yes." So then they were able to get a search warrant to look for anything that could implicate him in the murders. They were looking, they looked for blood spatter. They found traces of blood in the bathroom, and that was the thing. His apartment was so neat and clean, but the bathroom was really dirty.
Right.
The bathtub was just filthy, and although he had each time he murdered a woman, he bought a new saw, and the first two he threw away, but for some reason he still had the saw that he murdered Stacy with, and so they found that saw in the basement, and even his basement was neat. His exercise equipment, everything was just neat, and the police just thought that was so strange that here's this bachelor and everything is neat, but yet, his bathroom was dirty. And so he confessed, he said, "I did it." And
how did you? Sorry, you talk about that Captain Edward Lee, that it was a brilliant interrogation, and so you've just skipped over a little bit of how exactly they befriended this person, how they played upon him and his conscience to be able to do this. You go into it in the book. Tell us a little bit more about what exactly they did and how it turned from denial of even visiting prostitutes to this full confession. This really,
right?
This was instrumental at the trial. So
right. Well, there was no trial.
Yes,
there was no trial. He ultimately decided to plead guilty.
Well, that's what I mean. It negates the need for a trial when there's a confession. So there is some bargain or some deal made.
Right.
There's no need for a trial.
The police they tried to play to the fact that he lost his parents when he was young. And they said, these women have families too, and those families need closure. They need to know what happened. They need to know what you did to to these women, and if you did it, you have to tell us. You'll feel so much better if you tell us. And he, he didn't want to. He really didn't. But they just befriended him, and he thought they were his friends. And again, they said, we're all men, and we know what happens, and maybe things just got out of hand, and you couldn't control it. But you need to tell us now. You'll feel better, and they had never dealt with anything like that before,
right.
And they weren't. It was new territory.
Sure.
And they just finally wore him down, and he decided to confess, but he never said he was sorry for murdering the women. He never felt bad for that. That's something that always struck me. He apologized to the families, but he thought he was doing the police a favor by killing these women who didn't mean anything to anyone and were just prostitutes. And who were they? And nobody cares if they're dead, and I'm helping you.
Right. Well, that's the thing. There's a rationalization. Now, you say this is a shocking confession, and it is. Did he have to give the police all the details, all the graphic details, and was he forthcoming with everything?
Absolutely was. He absolutely was. He told, how he dismembered their bodies, and one of the women he cut up in smaller pieces than the other, and how he would put an arm and a leg in one bag and maybe feet and a head in another bag to make it easier to dispose of, to make it easier to carry. And then everything went to, so he had to tell them what dumpsters, he disposed of them in. And then the police, went to the landfill and talked to the people who ran the landfill to see the section of the landfill where those particular dumpsters would have gone, where the trash would have gone from those dumpsters.
Right.
And it was, it was like, I don't know, a week in the hot July sun, and it was a miracle. They did find a bag with the remains of one of the women, with Stacy's remains.
Right.
And those were the only remains that they ever found. They never found the rest of the bodies at all.
Now, finding the remains as per described by this person, knowing how difficult it is sometimes just to have a confession from one of these people without any real physical evidence, did that convince the police, Edward Lee, to say, yes, given everything, we definitely know because we have one body that despite not having the other two, we definitely are convinced that this guy is telling the truth?
Absolutely, absolutely. Even with a confession, you need physical evidence. And they were looking for evidence of these women at his house as well. They needed something because they were under the impression that this was going to go to trial, and so they wanted to give the DA some concrete evidence. And they dug up. He said he had some of the blood he had just flushed in the bathtub. It just went down the drain, and so they dug a big hole in the street and were trying to see if they could find any evidence. They put cameras in the pipes, and they found some worms, and they thought that the worms were drawn to protein, and so they thought that this was evidence of the remains of the women.
Right.
It turned out, however, it was just his protein shakes that these worms were after. And so they didn't find evidence of the bodies in the pipes. So they needed some concrete evidence. And it was I think a cadet, someone just out of the academy, who found the bag. And Ed said it was one of the dirtiest jobs that anyone there had ever had to do. But they wanted to do it. They wanted to help the families get closure as well as finding the evidence.
Certainly. certainly. Now, tell us about Edward Lee Jr. Why did he want this story to be told? I'm jumping ahead just a bit, but why is this an important thing for him to tell? I'm sure he doesn't have a dozen books out with his name on it, so why this story?
Well, he wanted the story to be told, I think, to show that I'm just speculating now, but I think it's because he wanted people to know that your neighbor, this could be anybody.
Right.
And I think he wanted to let the women know that, to be extra careful, to watch who you go with, because someone looks clean cut and like your average guy, and the next thing you know, you find out that he's a serial killer.
Sure. Now, why did he not exercise his right to have counsel when he was questioned at the police force?
When he was questioning. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I think deep down, on some level, he just wanted to get this information out. He just wanted it over with, and so I think that's why he didn't. But he never once invoked at all.
Right. Now, what was his demeanor like when he was recalling all the circumstances surrounding the murder and the dismemberment and disposal of the body? What was his demeanor like?
From talking with Ed, because I saw a little bit of a video, but he was pretty calm. Just telling the story. He wasn't all that upset at all. And after he wrote a letter to his boss saying, I'm sorry I did this. I mean, he wanted people still to think that he was a good guy. Right.
And he rationalized that murder as well. He wasn't very truthful with his boss about the circumstances surrounding that as well.
Absolutely not.
Which is real indication too that he doesn't, recognize what he did, and he certainly is rationalizing it right to the very end.
I don't think he felt 1 ounce of remorse, none whatsoever.
I think the thing is, if you are capable of remorse, you wouldn't be capable of killing women and just getting rid of them like trash, would you?
Well, I'm going to disagree with you there, Dan, and I'm going to reference the next book I have coming out, which is called Bone Crusher. I know I'm getting ahead of things, but
it's okay.
I've written Bone Crusher is my 4th book, and the first 2, as I said, were spouse-on-spouse murders, and one doctor murdered his wife, and another woman murdered her husband, and then there was Mailhot. None of those people I ever thought felt an ounce of remorse. But Larry Bright, who murdered 8 women in Peoria, Illinois, I truly believe he was sorry for what he did. I saw hours and hours and hours of videotape. And in one of them, he asked if he could make a statement to his mother. And the police said, sure, but anything you say we're going to use against you. He had already confessed at this point. And he was sobbing, and he was so sorry that he murdered the women, sorry that she had to have a son like him. And as a matter of fact, he wanted to stop so badly, he called in a tip on himself. He called in a tip to the hotline and said, you should investigate Larry Bright because I think he's doing this. And I really felt sorry for this man. I think he wanted to stop. He didn't want to do this. And I think sometimes there are people who commit these heinous crimes, but for whatever reasons can't stop. He was on crack, and he heard voices that said, kill, kill. And then when he was not on the crack, he wanted to stop, and he didn't know how. So I think that sometimes people can commit these awful murders and then really feel sorry that they did, and feel sorry for the victims, feel sorry for the families, not just sorry that they got caught.
Sure, sure. You include in your book, and I thought it was interesting, a story about Jocelyn Martel. You give the follow-up of one of the women who appear in the book, and after she was involved in this as well. You say that she was attacked by Jeffrey Mailhot.
Right.
Why do you feel it necessary to include that information in the book? And give us that story of the follow-up. It's very interesting.
It's not just her, it's both of them. It's Tease as well. You know, Jocelyn said at the hearing when he pleaded guilty, she made a statement and she said, I think God saved me so I could be here to help other women and help them get off the streets, and she was going to get off the streets. But the lure of the drugs is so great that she was back doing the same thing. And she was attacked by someone else, as was Tease Morris. They wanted to stop, but they couldn't. And they went back to doing it. And it's just, it's a shame. And I want people to know that these are real people with real problems. They're not just prostitutes. They're not people who can just be discarded, thrown away as trash like Mailhot did. And I just wanted people to know what happened to them afterwards. Unfortunately, they couldn't stop doing what they were doing. They couldn't get off the drugs. And that's what pushes them into this life of prostitution.
Well, I think the thing is, too, I applaud you for doing that as well, but I think we have to counter, you have to counter as well, is to focus our disdain for the killer and not try to attribute any of the blame, we'll say, to the victim. We always say, well, the innocent victim. Well, all victims are innocent.
Right.
So you always see those kinds of terms, and the prostitute is the person, it's almost nobody else is identified by their, and I use this word loosely, occupation, rather than who, they were just a prostitute, rather than a mother of two. Why wasn't a mother of two killed when it's reported in the media? No, it's a prostitute.
You're right.
So
you're absolutely right, which is why I talked to Stacy's, the father of her children, and I talked to Christine's sister, because that's exactly what I wanted people to know. Who they were. They were, as I said, daughters and sisters and mothers, and they weren't just prostitutes. They were women who made bad choices.
Yes, absolutely. But, again, like I say, the focus is that these people just happen to be the most vulnerable people that are willing to jump in a stranger's car, and they are the people that the serial killer picks for various reasons, and then that's what we have. So we have a situation where these people are just the most vulnerable people. I think it's something to consider as well.
Absolutely.
Rather than having any disdain for people that are the most vulnerable people out there, period.
Right.
Now, how did the researching and writing of this book personally affect you, if at all?
Well, this is an interesting phenomenon. When I'm writing and researching these books, I don't think about what I'm writing, and my style of writing is I don't even write from beginning to end. I could write the middle of the book first. I write whatever I have at the time, and then I put it all together and I send it to my publisher. But it doesn't hit me at all. And then it goes to the lawyers, and then it goes to the copy editors, and I get it back, and I have to, I look at pages that the copy editors have marked, and, I made a spelling mistake, this date is wrong. But again, I'm not thinking of this story as a cohesive whole at this point. Then it goes to the proofreaders. Then I get it back, and I have to read it from beginning to end. And I read it as a reader, and I'm horrified. That's when it hits me. That's when it affects me. When I think of, what happens, these are women. These are human beings who were murdered. But when I'm writing it, I'm writing it with more of a sort of a clinical eye, I guess you would say. I don't feel any emotion when I'm writing it whatsoever. It's research. I'm a journalist. I'm telling a story. I'm not being affected by the story until I read it as a reader.
Right. Now, a lot of people ask, and people are very surprised how many women, that the majority of the true crime market are women, actually, and that a vast majority, or at least, I won't say a vast majority, but a good, really good percentage, if not 50% or more, of the publishers, the agents, and the authors themselves are women in true crime. And a lot of people they wonder why anybody would handle some of these subjects, the gore, the graphic details, just the heinous nature of some of these crimes. Why do you think women are involved? Why do you think they're interested in true crime? And why do you think they're interested enough to write about it like yourself?
I can't answer for anyone. I know Ann Rule was a police officer before, so that right. was her interest. I'm an investigative reporter. I've been a reporter for 20 years. I always thought I would love to be a homicide detective. I would want to solve these puzzles. But I never wanted to start at the bottom and walk the beat. I just wanted to go right in to be a detective. So that was never going to happen. And I used to read true crime all the time, and I was fascinated, what makes people do this? I just loved the story. And one day I said, I can write this. I'm a reporter. I'm a writer. I'm an investigator. I want to tell the stories. I want to see what makes people do these things. And that's how I got into it. I always read Ann Rule. I just really, really, really liked the investigative part of it, what the police did.
Yes, absolutely. Now, getting back to the subject of your book, Ripper, Jeffrey Mailhot, is there a death penalty in Rhode Island?
No.
What happened in the end, and
where's he? He's in prison. He's in the Adult Correctional Institution in Rhode Island for life. No possibility of parole.
No possibility of parole. Okay. And so was he? What? So there was no trial at all. There was just a hearing to right. confirm. I'm sorry. I hope I don't have that wrong. I thought it was without parole. Maybe he's eligible when he's 70 something. I'm sorry. Right. I just don't remember. Right. Regardless, it's unlikely he'll be ever released from prison.
Absolutely not.
Well, that's good.
No, there was just a hearing where victims, made their statements, and then, he said, "I'm sorry for the families." Again, never apologizing to the women.
Right. Well, I think that it's sometimes it's a relief. I know in this country that criminals actually get, actual credit for at least pretending or showing remorse. I have a hard time finding that remorse. If they didn't have enough remorse to confess, it didn't have enough remorse to turn themselves in, if it didn't have enough remorse not to talk to another inmate in the institution and laugh and brag, what I'm saying is that some of those people will give an apology at trial and on the advice of their lawyer, I would imagine. But I don't think it's very genuine. I think it's disingenuine anyway. So I'm relieved when they don't show any remorse. It's because I don't want it making a difference. I think it would be maybe the families would. But you see, most of these guys realize at least that they should apologize to the families and their own families. So I think that's enough that they aren't cackling in court, because it could be worse. There are some people even like that, taunting victims after the fact or at court or at trial, or putting the families through trials and then acting up at the trial. So I guess it's a bit of a relief,
Right.
So I think maybe what you contended too, that he's not the worst of the worst. Maybe there is some credibility to that or some validity to that. So now, what's your what was the contribution of Captain Edward Lee? I know obviously he gave you some behind-the-scenes information, but
that's exactly what he did. When I decided to work on this case, I called him and I told him I was interested in writing a book, and my publisher was interested, and he said to me, I'm thinking of writing a book. And I said, I have no problem working with you and putting your name on the book in exchange for getting all this information from you. So that's what we did exactly. And so, I credited him as my co-author, although he will tell you he didn't write a word. But, he gave me access to all the information, access to the other officers, numerous interviews. He took me to visit, one of the families. So he was very, very helpful. I couldn't have done it without him.
Right. Now, so what has been the reaction from, the community with this book itself in Woonsocket, and has there been any criticism of Captain Lee at all for his participation in this book? No one's talking about...
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Everyone was glad that the story was out. And the newspapers, the Providence Journal, they all interviewed him. The families were glad that people knew the story. No, there was no criticism whatsoever.
Oh, that's very good. That's very encouraging. How big was this story? How far did it resonate outside of Woonsocket?
It pretty far. Cold Case Files did a story on it. They
great.
A segment. So it pretty far. I mean, Woonsocket, wasn't used to having a serial killer.
No, it's very unusual.
Right.
Now, we have a few minutes left. Maybe you can tell us about some of your projects that you're working on now after this incredible book, Ripper. Tell us about your latest one, and then maybe you can go back to your earlier titles.
Right. Well, as I was mentioning, Bone Crusher is about Larry Bright, a serial killer in Peoria, Illinois. It'll be out, I think, October 5th. He murdered 8 women, 8 prostitutes. Well, I'm not even going to say they were prostitutes. 8 women who were working to feed their drug habits.
Right.
And he, as I said, he was on crack, and he heard voices that told him to kill. And he dismembered 4 of the women and burned their bodies in a fire pit in his backyard. And then after everything was burned, he would crush the bones into ash, so hence the title. And then he would dispose of the ash in various places in Peoria and in other towns nearby where his grandmother lived. And 4 of the women he disposed of their bodies intact, and which is unusual because serial killers usually have one method of murdering people.
Right.
And so the police thought that there was some, devious method to why, were they trying to throw the police? Was he trying to throw police off the track by, burning some women and then just disposing of the other ones? And so they asked him, and they said, why did you not burn those other women? And he said, I couldn't because my mother was having company, and so I couldn't use the backyard to burn them. So it was just a matter of convenience. And
I see.
Yeah, and but I was always thinking, didn't anybody smell anything? His mother did once, and she asked him about it, and he said he was burning plastic, and she believed him. I mean, he was such a mama's boy, and when I watched like 40 hours, I think, of video of his videotape interrogation. And he just was so different from Mailhot. He just was really like a regular guy, like someone that you would want to hang out with. And again, I just really believe that he was so sorry for what he did, and he wanted to stop. And the only way he knew to stop was by turning himself in. And although he couldn't bring himself to do it physically, he did call the police and say, look at Larry Bright, he's doing this. And
wow.
And the women, again, the same with Mailhot, the women who fought him, he let them go.
Incredible.
And because, again, he didn't think that they would go to the police, which they didn't. And because, one woman got away, and she never went to the police because there was a warrant out on her arrest. And one of her friends finally went to the police and said, I think you should talk to her because I think she might have had the same experience, but at least she made it out alive.
Right. How did you come to have access to this 40 hours of videotape?
The state's attorney, since he confessed and there were no appeals, it was all public information, and so the state's attorney for Peoria just gave me all the DVDs.
So
and,
did you
3,000 pages of other police reports and everything.
Wow. So that is featured prominently in your book as well? Some of that transcripts?
From the transcripts, yeah. Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. That's very convincing
stuff. He took them everywhere too. He took them because to find the bodies were found, but he took them to the places where he said he dumped the bones and ash of the other women so that they could have something, for the families. Although they didn't, they did find some ash, but they just didn't find everything.
So it was pretty well the evidence that he pointed them to was pretty inconclusive. Is that what you're saying? Well,
actually, the evidence for the 4 women who were dismembered and burned, they couldn't get any DNA whatsoever, so it was only his confession. They did get DNA from one of the women with whom he had sex, one of the women whose body he disposed of intact. So they got his DNA from her. But the women who were burned, the bones were so small they couldn't even identify those women. They only knew who they were because they had gone missing and people had reported them missing. And then he looked at their photos and said, yeah, that one and that one. And there were 2 other women missing, but he said he had murdered, but he said he had nothing to do with them, although police weren't convinced, but they had no evidence to tie him to those other cases.
And when is Bone Crusher due to be released? Sorry?
October 5th.
October 5th? Well, we'll have to be talking to you.
Yeah, it'll be on Kindle as well.
Oh, great. And ebook as well? Or is Pinnacle publishing ebooks as of yet?
Yes.
Oh, they are. Great. Yes, and you have a couple other books as well, you mentioned? A couple of true crime titles?
One is called Murder at Morse's Pond, about a world-renowned allergist who murdered his wife. And the other one in Massachusetts, and the other one's called An Act of Murder, about Kimberly Rico, who murdered her husband in Maryland. And both those cases were prominently featured. The first one, Morse's Pond, was on. Dateline did a story about Dr. Dirk Greinader, and Kimberly was on Forensic Files. So they're pretty high-profile cases.
Right. Oh, that's great. And you are working, obviously, as a journalist, so are you working full-time as an author, or you're doing both?
I'm looking for another case at this point, but I do freelance writing and ghost writing as well.
So you're a very busy journalist and writer.
Yeah, right.
Oh, that's great. Well, I want to thank you very much for a fascinating interview about a great book, Ripper. And I want to thank you very much for spending this time for us and a spellbinding story here for us. So thank you very much, and you have a good evening.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you very much. You've been listening to Linda Rosencrance. Good evening. Listening to Linda Rosencrance, author of Ripper, and this is True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Have yourself a good evening. Good night.